Let's discuss Jupiter in the 6th house in all 12 zodiac signs. We'll kick it off with a quick reminder of what the 6th house itself represents, and then we'll do the similar thing for Jupiter. Then we'll move on to talk about Jupiter in the 6th house, show you how to identify the basic seeds that we need to interpret when Jupiter is in the 6th house, and then we'll flesh that out into the fundamental baseline interpretations of Jupiter in the 6th. From there, however, we'll move on to talk about the 12 zodiac signs that Jupiter could be in while in the 6th house. And we'll tailor the interpretation to each one of those 12 using 12 example charts of 12 famous people. The 6th house is in the western part of the sky, but it's below the ground in the west. And so it symbolizes everything that holds up and supports whatever the western horizon symbolizes. The western horizon is where the sun sets, so it symbolizes disappearance and death. This is why the 6th house, by supporting that, symbolizes illness, disease, or even injuries, things that lead to death. In turn, this is why the 6th house signifies things that we dread, things we don't like, things that give us anxiety, things that put us in fear. And in turn, this is why the 6th house symbolizes things that subordinate us or defeat us or threaten to subordinate and defeat us. Another thing the sunset represents is other people, because sun represents self. So when it sets, other people become prominent. By supporting that, the 6th house represents the people who support other people. In other words, people that don't support us. In other words, the 6th is the house of enemies. And this is why it also symbolizes conflict, the way that we relate with enemies. So it has to do with the way that we'll fight and struggle, etc. Finally, the 6th house represents our debts, what we owe to other people. Now, let's get up to date on what Jupiter symbolizes. Jupiter is the planet of positivity, and positivity means addition. So that's why Jupiter represents increase and all things associated with increase like growth and success. Hence, Jupiter represents creation, reproduction, and children, and this is why it has to do with parenting, which in turn is why it represents all the parental figures in society, like teachers, priests, gurus, and so forth. Jupiter ultimately represents wisdom, because that is what we receive from the parental figures in society. Another sense of positivity is optimism, so Jupiter represents trust and faith. This is why Jupiter signifies generosity, a generous outlook and a generous attitude. And generosity also implies willingness to cooperate and willingness to go along with the way other people want you to do things. So Jupiter is quite lawful, and hence it represents honesty and virtue. Now that we're refreshed about what Jupiter represents and what the 6th house represents, let's identify the seeds of what is going on when Jupiter is in the 6th house. What do we need to pay attention to in order to interpret this correctly? So one big thing is that Jupiter is the planet of trust, but the 6th is the house of enemies. So enemies are not people that we're supposed to trust, but Jupiter is the planet that likes to trust. So this is a conflict, and we're going to need to keep our eye on that to interpret Jupiter in the 6th house accurately. Another issue is that Jupiter is generous, but the 6th house represents conflicts. When you're fighting against somebody, you shouldn't be generous with them. So this is another conflict that we need to keep our eye on to understand what Jupiter represents in the 6th house. Third thing is that Jupiter represents success, but the 6th house represents defeat. So now let me show you how to take these 3 seeds and form some basic ideas about what these interpretations should be, just to get a grasp on what Jupiter in the 6th house basically symbolizes. Because Jupiter in the 6th represents trusting enemies, Jupiter in the 6th house indicates misplaced trust. It means trusting people too soon, trusting people who really didn't deserve to be trusted, easily conned, easily fooled, not skeptical enough, overly optimistic, overly trusting. That's the basic expectation with this seed. There's other ways that it could permutate in different circumstances and different signs and so forth, but we'll look at that next. For now, let's just iron out what the basic expectation of Jupiter in the sixth is. Jupiter in the sixth represents being too generous with people that you should be strict with. And so when Jupiter is in the sixth house, the native tends to be soft in their confrontations. They tend to be gentle where they should be tough, but they tend to be tough where they should be gentle. So they have a misplaced sense of generosity. The third issue, that Jupiter is the planet of success, but it's in the house of defeat, means that Jupiter in the sixth signifies facing quite a few challenges, being surrounded by challenges, feeling surrounded by enemies all the time, and not really being very satisfied or at peace. So this sounds like a kind of a difficult placement, and indeed it is. Some placements are more difficult than others. But now let's turn our attention to how Jupiter's placement in the 12 zodiac signs might adjust or permutate this baseline concept. Let's start with Jupiter in Aries in the sixth house. So we have the basic idea that Jupiter in the sixth in general is overtrusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. Now, how about the fact that it's in Aries? Well, Jupiter in Aries tends to indicate a person who's quite ambitious and quite confident in how they assert themselves, or they lead others confidently, and they have kind of trust in their individuality. This is an interesting juxtaposition with the baseline of Jupiter in the sixth, isn't it? If we also take into account the lordships that Jupiter has when it's in Aries in the sixth house, it's the lord of the second and the fifth. So the second lord and the fifth lord going into the sixth house adds a sense that the problems that Jupiter has in the sixth house will be targeted mostly towards how one expresses oneself and a bit in how one expresses affection. Helen Keller had Jupiter in Aries in the sixth house. So clearly she matches this whole description really well. Why is she so challenged? She's obviously much more challenged than most people with Jupiter in Aries in the sixth house. Why? First of all, notice that Jupiter in Aries in the sixth is right next to Saturn, and Saturn in Aries is a debilitated Saturn. So it's highlighting the challenging nature. Yet it's also a Raja Yoga, because Saturn is the fourth lord and Jupiter is the fifth. So it's indicating heightened challenges with the ability to deal productively with them. But for a real clincher, take a look at her Mercury. It's exactly at 0 degrees, which is a big deal, but it's also at 0 degrees between a water sign and a fire sign, which is an even bigger deal. It really incapacitates a planet. So the planet of expression and communication is very challenged by being at Gandanta, or 0 degrees between water and fire sign. On top of that, the debilitated Saturn is with Jupiter in the sixth. Now let's take a look at Jupiter in Taurus in the sixth house. We'll take the baseline that Jupiter in the sixth tends to mean overtrusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. Now, how about Jupiter in Taurus? That indicates a person who's quite talented, quite sexually attractive or charismatic, beautiful, prosperous. In this situation, also Jupiter is the first and the fourth lords. The first and fourth lord in the sixth indicates a difficulty being happy with oneself. Raquel Welch has Jupiter in Taurus in the sixth house. So she really exemplifies somebody that's very beautiful, very attractive, very prosperous, very talented. Why is it that she's so attractive? Other people with Jupiter and Taurus in the sixth house are probably also attractive, but not everybody with Jupiter and Taurus in the sixth is Raquel Welch. So what is it about her? Well, it's actually quite an interesting thing. Her eighth lord, which is very important for sexiness, is in the 12th house, which is also related with sexiness, in Scorpio, which is very related to sexiness. And it is the moon, which is very related to beauty and attractiveness and desire and desirability. And that puts it in a position where it's directly aspecting Jupiter and Taurus. Secondly, occupying her eighth house is Venus in Cancer, watery Cancer, as the 11th lord, the lord of pleasure. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter and Gemini in the sixth house. Starting with the basic idea that Jupiter in the sixth is over-trusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. And now thinking about Jupiter and Gemini, indicating somebody who's likable, who's good at expressing themselves. They're expressive, and they're quite inventive. Jupiter here is the 12th and the 3rd lord. So to have the 3rd lord and the 12th lord in the sixth counteracts the basic idea that Jupiter in the sixth should be soft on enemies. Because the 3rd lord in the sixth is very strong, and the 12th lord in the sixth is also very strong and hard on enemies. So when Jupiter is in Gemini, it really doesn't have a typical Jupiter in the sixth house nature to it. Tippi Hedren has Jupiter and Gemini in the sixth house. Why is she so successful when Jupiter in the sixth is supposed to be surrounded by enemies and kind of defeated? Well, her first lord is there in her first house, and it is with her 4th lord exalted, forming Raja Yoga. And they are also with the 10th lord and the 5th lord, forming more Raja Yogas. So the first house is really, really packed with strong planets that are domicile and exalted and in Raja Yoga. About Tippi, we can also ask, why was she so artistic and attractive? Well, Jupiter in Gemini tends to be attractive or likable, but why so much in her case? Again, look at what she's got going on in her first house. The 11th lord is in the first house, exalted, so that's going to make a person very pleasant. The 5th lord joins the 11th lord there, so that's going to make her quite artistic. And the 8th lord joins this mix, adding the sexy factor. On top of that, she has the 1st lord there in the first house, giving strength to the first house, which represents the appearance. And on top of that, she has the moon in the 10th house in Libra. The moon is very beautiful, and the 10th house is very obvious. Before we move on from Tippi, we can also ask about this activism. Because Jupiter in the 6th house tends to be soft on enemies. Well, she's very moral because of Mercury in her 2nd house as the 6th and 9th lords, in a degree which puts it in exact trine with Jupiter in the 6th and Moon in the 10th. So she's going to have a diplomatic, intelligent, but firm way of dealing with things that she does not like. Now let's move on to discuss Jupiter in Cancer in the 6th house. Start with the baseline that Jupiter in the 6th is over-trusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. Now Jupiter in Cancer is very, very optimistic, very prosperous, and very open and honest and trustworthy. In this case, Jupiter is the 11th and the 2nd lords. So that takes 11 and 2, putting them in the 6th house, gives a sense of challenges to prosperity or wealth and or to expression. Janis Joplin has Jupiter in Cancer in the 6th house. Why is she so expressive? Well, one reason that we really shouldn't overlook is that if Jupiter's in Cancer, it's exalted, and if it's the 2nd lord, it's exalting the lord of voice, especially because Jupiter itself is the planet of sound. And then it's the 11th lord too. So it's going to give it artistic, exalted voice. But it's not free from challenges. It's not free from problems. Don't overlook the fact that the 3rd lord for Janis Joplin is in the 11th house. That's very important for people with artistic skills. At the same time, the 4th lord is Venus, who is in her 1st house. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Leo in the 6th house. starting with the basic idea that Jupiter in the sixth is overtrusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. Now, what about Jupiter in Leo? Well, Jupiter in Leo is a person who's quite brave and not afraid to be influential and assertive, not afraid to take a risk. In this case, Jupiter owns the 10th and the first houses. So to put the 10th and the first lord in the sixth fits well. These lords belong in the sixth house because they make one tough on enemies. So again, Jupiter in Leo in the sixth, like Jupiter and Gemini in the sixth, counteracts the baseline idea that Jupiter in the sixth is too soft. Tony Hawk has Jupiter in Leo in the sixth house. He is an extreme risk taker. That's what skateboarding is kind of all about. Why? Why is he so brave? Sure, it's Jupiter in Leo having those traits, but in addition to that, his sixth lord sun is in the third house with his third lord Venus. So combining third and sixth gives a person a lot of bravery and strength. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Virgo in the sixth house, starting with the idea that Jupiter in the sixth generically represents being overtrusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. What about the fact that it's in Virgo? Well, Jupiter in Virgo is very organizationally inclined, and it's very legally inclined, and it's very verbal. Here, Jupiter is the 9th and the 12th lord. So this is going to even increase the amount of sense of legalness. And it's also going to put the person a bit like they operate behind the scenes. Joseph McCarthy, he's got Jupiter in Virgo in the sixth house. But he's a paranoid maniac. So why is he so paranoid? Not everybody with Jupiter and Virgo in the sixth house is going to become a paranoid conspiracy theorist like Joseph McCarthy. What's going on in his chart? First of all, he's got a debilitated Saturn in his first house. That's problematic in general and gives one an outlook on life like things are wrong. I should not be trusting to anybody. So this is really doing a weird thing with Jupiter's overtrusting nature of Jupiter in the sixth. So his ability to believe things without significant facts is a trademark of Jupiter in the sixth. But the ability to distrust others is a trademark of Saturn and Aries in the first. So you put the two and two together, distrusting particular people without really significant factual evidence. In addition, his fifth lord sun is in the eighth house, so his mind is never really looking at the obvious things. It's kind of looking for the things that are behind the scenes. Meanwhile, his eighth lord Mars is in the seventh house, where it's aspecting his ascendant. So it's quite influential eighth house. So he's always thinking about conspiracies or espionage. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Libra in the sixth house. We start off with the basic baseline that Jupiter in the sixth is overtrusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. And now let's add in what Jupiter is like when it's in Libra. Jupiter in Libra is intellectual, democratic. It likes power to be distributed and shared, and fair. It likes justice. In this case, Jupiter is the 8th and the 11th lords. So having the 11th and 8th lords in the 6th house makes Jupiter less soft again. Less soft than you would usually have, especially because of the 8th lord. The 8th lord in the 6th house will tend to find problems with the enemies instead of ignoring those problems. George Washington had Jupiter in Libra in the 6th house. Obviously, he's neither soft nor defeated. He's an army general, successful army general, and he's the first president of the United States. So why? Well, one thing is that his first lord is exalted in the 11th house, and it's not just exalted, but it's Vargotama exalted, which means that its subdivision, the Navamsha subdivision or the 9th subdivision of its sign, is also its exaltation sign. So it's very, very, very exalted. His first lord is very, very, very exalted. So you don't expect such a person to be easily defeatable or very wishy-washy. Secondly, he has Mars from its own sign, domicile Mars, aspecting his ascendant. So you don't expect this person to be wimpy or soft. Now let's think about Jupiter and Scorpio in the 6th house. The baseline idea of Jupiter in the sixth is over-trusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. Baseline idea about Jupiter in Scorpio is a heterodox person, which means a person who thinks differently, kind of intentionally. Jupiter in Scorpio is also quite a sexy person and also a bit kind of deceptive or difficult to understand. Here Jupiter is the 7th and the 10th lords, which again makes it less soft than the generic idea of Jupiter in the 6th house, but gives the likelihood that the problems associated with Jupiter in the 6th house have more to do with sexual and familial relationships. Candy Barr has Jupiter in Scorpio in the 6th house. Why is she so sexual? Not everybody with Jupiter and Scorpio in the 6th house is as sexual as Candy Barr. So what made her so sexual? Well, really, look at that 8th house, Rahu, almost exactly on the 8th house cusp. In addition to that, she has a certain signature that you can look for all the time for people that have pretty active libidos. It's Mars in Libra, especially if it's compounded with Venus being in a masculine fire sign. So she has Venus in Leo while Mars is in Libra, and they're both bracketing her moon. In addition to that, she has Mercury, her first lord, very close to her ascendant degree in the first house. So she's not just a sexually active person, but she's a person that other people really want to be sexually active. They like it. They'll pay for it. Now let's talk about Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 6th house. The basic idea of Jupiter in the 6th house is over-trusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. The basic idea of Jupiter in Sagittarius, however, is you're a teacher. You understand and you explain things. You have a hunger for knowledge. You like to tell people what to do. You like to teach people. You like to direct them. You like to guide them. You also like to advocate for certain ideas and positions and things and people. In this case, Jupiter is the 6th lord and also the 9th lord. So it's going to subtract from the problematic nature of Jupiter in the 6th because it's domicile. But it's going to add a sense of heterodoxy similar to Jupiter being in Scorpio because it's the 9th lord in the 6th house, which signifies heterodoxy. Vincent van Gogh has Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 6th house. So you may say, this guy was really troubled. Should everybody with Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 6th house expect to be as troubled as Vincent? Not unless they have Jupiter with Ketu and the moon at the exact degree of the cusp of the 6th house, like Van Gogh did. Well, also Vincent van Gogh was really, really artistic. So should everybody with Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 6th house expect to be as good of a painter as Vincent van Gogh? Not unless they have the 11th lord, Venus, at that high degree in Pisces, similar to George Washington, where it's not just exalted, but it's Vargotam exalted. Not to mention forming Raja Yogas with the 5th lord, while the 3rd lord sits near the cusp of the 10th house. Now let's turn our attention to Jupiter in Capricorn in the 6th house. We'll start with the baseline idea that Jupiter in the 6th is over-trusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. And now let's think about Jupiter in Capricorn, which indicates distrust or skepticism, being unusual, and having a kind of Machiavellian attitude, which is a highly practical attitude, more practical than ideological. In this case, Jupiter is the 5th and the 8th lord. When the 5th and the 8th are connected, one has a critical nature. They tend to look behind the scenes and they tend to look under the surface of things. Edgar Cayce has Jupiter in Capricorn in the 6th house. Should everybody with Jupiter in Capricorn in the 6th house therefore expect to be the world's most renowned psychic? Not unless you have a chart like looks like this to go along with your Jupiter in Capricorn in the 6th house. Look at that 8th house. It's quite significant. Plus, along with his Jupiter in Capricorn, he has exalted Mars. Now let's talk about Jupiter in Aquarius in the 6th house. Start with the idea that Jupiter in the 6th generically represents being overtrusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. Now ask, what does Jupiter in Aquarius tend to represent? It tends to represent being an iconoclast, and it signifies being a person who has popular appeal, not particularly well liked by leaders and rulers and managers, but very well liked by customers, very well liked by the people in the block and the neighborhood, ordinary people. And also, Jupiter in Aquarius has a good potential to gain wealth. In this case, it's the 4th and the 7th Lord. So the problems with Jupiter in the 6th will tend to express themselves towards relationships and family. Hugh Hefner has Jupiter in Aquarius in the 6th house. Hugh Hefner obviously matches many of these things. But why is he so successful at what he does? Well, his chart is extremely successful. First of all, his first lord is in the 8th house, the sexy house, with an exalted planet, the sun. So it's very successfully in the 8th house. And not only is his first lord with an exalted planet in a sexual house, but so is his moon. His moon is in the 7th house with an exalted Venus. His 6th lord, Saturn, is in the 3rd, while the 3rd lord, Mars, is in the 6th. So don't expect him to be a pushover. Expect him to have a lot of drive. He's not going to be soft or surrounded by challenges or giving up to challenges like you would expect from Jupiter in the 6th house, because he has an exchange between the 3rd and the 6th, which is very important for making a person strong. Take a closer look at what's going on in his 7th house, and it is the 11th Lord, Moon, joining the 9th Lord and the 2nd Lord. So it's very, very prosperous. Finally, let's take a look at Jupiter in Pisces in the 6th house, starting with the basic idea that Jupiter in the 6th is overtrusting, soft on enemies, and surrounded by challenges. Jupiter in Pisces represents being very intelligent, very creative, and very positive, especially emotionally positive. In this case, Jupiter is the 6th Lord and also the 3rd. So it's going to be less soft. It's not going to have quite as much of a problem of being too soft on enemies, because it's the 6th Lord in the 6th house and it's the 3rd Lord in the 6th house. Anais Nin has Jupiter in Pisces in the 6th house. So she's very intelligent, creative, etc., etc., etc. And she's not really soft. She's brave. Yet you can see that she's a bit like kind of too much like Jupiter in the 6th represents in its excess of positivity. But she's extremely sexual. She's an eroticist. So should everybody with Jupiter in Pisces look forward to that kind of a life? Sure, if you have the rest of the chart that Anais Nin has. Especially look at the 1st house for her. This is the trademark that I mentioned before with Candy Bar. It's Mars and Libra, very close to Rahu. So Mars in Libra is really signifies a lot of libido, and when it's with Rahu, it's going to be explosive. So I hope that gives you a good idea of what Jupiter in the 6th house signifies and how that signification modifies or changes per zodiac sign, and then beyond that, per chart. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdicara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tara to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.